Let me hit record so we could do this for all the students. Because I did uh, I had student teacher conferences about a month ago, and I was told by like all of my kids' teachers, thank you so much for your sons always having like the camera ready and they're participating and you could see them. And so anyway, I know teachers appreciate it. I really appreciate it. If it's possible for you to do so, please do. Good morning, everybody. Let's see. Oh, too much sunlight. First of all, are there any questions about class as we look forward here? Let me see. Let me pop out of this window. I'm working on another class at the same time and get to this course so that I could see what's due. Looks like the birthing inequality post is due by this Thursday. And I've got most everything graded. I think everything graded and returned to people. So if you have any questions about your grades or your feedback, I want to be as accessible as possible and help you out. I can explain any of that. As we look to exam one, there's only 2 people that looks like that have completed exam 1. That's fine. It's open till Friday. Take the time. Yes, you can copy and paste answers from your weekly assignments because the questions are identical or almost identical, which means that if you've been keeping up week to week and you've really been staying on top of things as much as you can, then you can use that as a basis for those essays. Now, of course, these essays are worth 25 points apiece. I want them to include your personal insight, what you've learned in the class, multiple textbook connections, and really just try and be as thorough as possible. So, but yeah, it's open note, open. You only have, I think it's a couple hours. So it doesn't matter. I want to reinforce the correct information multiple times and I want you to retain it. That's why we're doing that. All right, so we are going to be getting to, let me see, is it grade? Let me see what the next discussion is. Really right now, I guess everybody, I think it's most important that you focus on the moment and on the exam, which covers, I think, the first 4 chapters, because we're going to be working our way through 8 chapters. Yes, I have PowerPoints that have a lot of extra info. Yes, the syllabus has a ton of links to peer-reviewed, really, top-notch articles that I think are scholarly. And so, please use those, even though you don't have to read them all, to help you out as much as possible. I wanted to talk briefly today about race. And this really is, what I was thinking about yesterday when I was grading papers, and I think the discussions have been really good, actually. And I think that people have been replying to people respectfully, even if they don't agree. And I would say this, that I realized while I was reading a lot of it, that what's unique about this course is there's a lot of people taking it who are going into like medical careers and medical fields. And not necessarily, that doesn't mean that people have necessarily had a whole lot of sociology, necessarily. So I just wanted to address the topic of race today in a really general sense. And then if anybody had any questions or comments or concerns, anything relating to the class. I guess first thing I should say is that this really doesn't come as a surprise to any of us because this book, we talk a lot about social factors that have to do with, right, health statistics and, things that we can look at, data that we can measure. And that comes from gender. It comes from ability or differing levels of ability. It comes from race. We examine age as a component. Excuse me. And then we look at how these things are interrelated. So we're going to be talking about inequality and poverty and race often, right? So I don't think it's something that people aren't, used to in this context, especially when looking at the big differences and discrepancies and disparities for health and healthcare statistics and things like that. Now, a lot of the reason we do this is because you might be taking an awful lot of science classes, but there's a whole level, right, beyond just epidemiology and sickness and health and how we define those things that gets to human behavior, and not just the psychology of it, but really nurture social interaction and human behavior. And so that's why it's so very interesting. It's so very different for human beings. And just when we think we know what somebody's going to do, that's why I study sociology. Human beings go the other way, right? I just want to say a couple things. First of all, is that when we talk about race all semester long, there's some things that I say over and over. There's some people that may have had me for other classes, maybe not. When I talk about race in the context of any class, it is always about responsibility and not guilt. Guilt, I think, is what you might feel if you know something needs to be done or you haven't done something, but it's kind of useless to me as a feeling. And my dad jokes about guilt in the Catholic Church. I didn't grow up in the Catholic Church. I don't feel, like it's a great motivator for students. So if we're talking about race, it's not about guilt. It's not that anybody here had a massive hand in making sure that people of certain racial backgrounds or genders or this and that and the other were oppressing people singularly, like you had anything to do with it. That being said, I want us to focus more on responsibility because I think that issues of race, and I don't, you can't say issues of race in the last 4 years, right? Or the last 8 years, or the last 10 years. Issues of race, whenever we address it, considering the historical context, which is always what I'm asking for. Please keep in mind, this is a history timeline. Back here is the past. This is nowish, because there is no now. The second those words leave my mouth, we're in the ish, we're in the past, right? And then the future. So we don't want to be doing the same thing, right? If we don't pay attention to that, we'll do the same thing, which is the economy, let's say, for an example, takes a downturn. Historically, people look and blame people of color. People are coming to this country from outside. That we look at all and blame all of the usual suspects. Well, a lot of times those economic downturns have nothing to do with those people whatsoever. Excuse me. Sorry, I have to mute this for 1 second. Sorry, everybody, got a septic problem out here on the farm. Anyway, whenever we talk about this, if we don't pay attention to the past, then we're doomed to repeat that piece where we blame the usual suspects. Well, what good does that do? Just if we're talking about this one topic, right? People coming from other countries, not coming here legally. Well, we always blame the individual. But from a sociological standpoint, I want us to look at every issue from at least 3 different perspectives, like a structural functional perspective, which says that society is functioning, things are working, they're good. A conflict perspective, which looks at inequality, right? And the kind of conflict that comes up because of inequality. And those are big macro level perspectives. And then a micro level perspective, which is like symbolic interaction. What does race mean to you as an individual in your life, living or growing up where you're growing up? The reason I say that is because if we look at an issue like immigration, we see an economic downturn. Then we see the usual blaming of the usual people. But what I don't often see, let's use Greeley as an example, right? They've got a massive CAFO there. These companies advertise for people in Mexico and bus people up here and then work with authorities, and they have a system worked out and they know this. Yet we always blame the individuals. So I want us to take a look at any type of issue, whether it's race or gender or whatever that is, from as many perspectives as possible, right? So the same is true with our discussions here in this class. And it's not just like, there's nothing PC about it. There's nothing that I want to like just keep people being respectful. I want us, this is college. I want us with our thoughts to challenge each other and support that with data and be able to, respectfully go back and forth and present new ideas. But the issue of white privilege came up in the most recent discussion, which is a very real thing and statistically measurable, and the amount of inequality across many different planes of, and fields and ways that we could look at it is statistically important and significant, as well as socially significant for the people that experience that. Now, that being said, both my parents are teachers. When we say white privilege or peach privilege or whatever pale color freckled that I am as a ginger, it doesn't mean that all people of European descent have it on easy street. That is a sort of extreme take on it. It means that there are some advantages I have based on the color of my skin that other people might not. And what we were talking about most recently was like access to education. if people were literally, and I think, right, I can't remember her name. She's 66 years old. And when she was 6 years old, she was, oh, what's her name? Anyway, one of the first African-American students in the South to attend school. Just saw this the other day. She's 66. She just got the chance to go to school as an African-American person legally in this country 60 years ago. So if until 60 years ago, you didn't have access to healthcare or access to ownership or access to education, of course you're going to be disadvantaged. Of course, people are starting off with different privileges. Now, again, that doesn't mean that your life is on easy street, but it means that institutionally, the people who are dominant, and whether that's a dominant race or whether that's dominant power, right? Because we examine all the time in sociology, power and access, and what does that mean? We understand that those people created the rules, right? Those people were the people that were keeping these folks from having that access. Now, what about personal responsibility? Well, there's a lot of personal responsibility associated with being a woman, being an elderly person, being a person of differing abilities, being a person of different racial, backgrounds. But we also have to intersect that personal experience and responsibility, that micro level business, with the macro level business. Could you actually physically go to school? Could you actually physically get a loan? What were those barriers? How did that connect to the transmission of wealth or not for you or your family for decades and decades and decades and decades? And of course, we're looking at big statistics. I think that by 2004, people who are considered minority status will be over 50% of the population. There is no such thing as a pure race. People can agree on that, whether they're, scientists looking at a genetic level or whatever that might be. That doesn't exist on a physiological level. Race is a socially constructed concept. And unfortunately, and I say this in social all the time, even if things aren't real, if they are real in their repercussions, then they are real. Meaning that most of racism in the history of that, suggesting that people's skull sizes mean that they're more criminally insane or that they are more human because the cranial capacity of a white person is twice that of an African American. Look, all of that is built on a foundation of lies. And so we know that that can be dismantled, right? So we know it exists, it's real in its consequences. Now, how do I know that? How do you know that? Like, how do we know it? And I would say that this is, and I had a great conversation with a student yesterday. I love connecting with my students, and I really do want to help everybody succeed. And I guess that one of the things we talked about was we're not very good in this culture at listening. I'm not, blah, 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 blah. I talk all the freaking time, just too much, talk. But if I really want to know about the experience of a woman in this country or in this culture or in any scenario, I listen. If I want to know about the experience of a Black woman or somebody who identifies as the gender female and the race African American, I listen. If I want to know what it's like for a member of the transgender community, I listen, right? Because on some of these things I know about, I might identify with, and in some of these things I don't, right? So I guess that I want us to understand that issues of race come up frequently. I think that we're all about in this class responsibility, connecting the dots, connecting the facts, and staying out of sort of, more extreme zones, because there are all sorts of people that represent that, right? Like, do I really want, I don't know, I'm thinking of Jack Black or Donald Trump to represent all white people? No, I don't. I stop. Just like more often we even put that burden on people like, well, that person's an extremist or that person represents all Black people. I think that's a significant burden. No one person represents all other people of a religious faith or background or persuasion. So anyway, if there's any questions, if there's any comments, if there's any thoughts, I think everybody's doing a good job. And then I realized that we talk about race so much in here that it might be valuable, at least for people to identify where we're coming from, my goals as a class, in regards to responsibility, not guilt, and things like that. So if anybody has anything to contribute, cool. If there is nothing to contribute, that's fine too. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody?
Question.
I'm sorry, what now? Ooh, it might be.
I was wondering, like, when it comes to using certain words to describe people of color, like, are there ones that you've seen come up that you don't think are, like, respectful in the way that they're written or spoken, or are there ones that you do prefer to be used? Does that make sense?
Sure. And I think society dictates that, right? In that, if somebody says colored folks or uses the N word, like, yeah, it's a word that exists. Language is important. But I think that there's some collective idea of what's disrespectful. And that could be across the board.
Yeah.
That could be the difference between saying the transgender community and not fully knowing and saying the transgendered community. It can be just a language piece, or it could be words that we quite clearly have agreed upon in society that don't do us any good anymore. I mean, saying the China virus, whoever's mouth it comes out of, is clearly racist. You know, you're not referencing a particular domain for a particular reason. You're just making it harder for people in that way, right? So I think that obvious, overt racism, for most of us, that would be obvious. And I think, again, Noel, the guideline is if we really want to know, we ask someone. If we're interacting with a person of color, if we're interacting with someone of that community, we could say, hey, do you feel comfortable? Do you want to be called black? Do you want to be called brown folks? Do you want to be called African American? Does it matter to you? For some people, pronouns are really important. For other people, it doesn't matter so much. So I think the intent, how respectful we can be, is important, right? I mean, when we use the term alien, that's ridiculous. No human beings are aliens. They're human beings, right? They might be foreign to a place, but it's used as a term to denigrate people. Just like the China virus, the word China isn't inherently like wrong, but when you start using that to refer to people in the scope of a pandemic and in the way that you're using it, yeah, it can be an abusive term. It can have negative impact. So does that answer that question?
Yeah, sorry.
No.
I realized it's kind of a stupid question now that I asked, but thank you.
No, it's not. Where we're in an age of many different things. One is it's really important how people identify to those people. And some is to the younger generation, there just aren't the same hangups. They're not as hung up on the war on drugs. Young people aren't as hung up on sexual identity. Like gay marriage isn't such a big deal. But I think that resides within the individual and it changes frequently. So being, mindful or respectful of it is important. Other thoughts, questions, or anything else? Concerns, anything? Well, I think it's valuable to bring up. It's CSU, which is, so I teach at 3 different institutions, Front Range, CU, and CSU. And, it seems like every semester for the last several years, somebody's just done something awful at CSU in regards to race. They've painted their face black and said Wakanda. They've hung a toilet paper noose around a person of color, students of color outside their dorm room. You name it. Some really awful behavior. A parent called, remember that a couple years ago? 2 Native American young guys were getting a tour, and a parent, called because she didn't feel that they belonged on the tour, like as if there's a motivation for jumping in on a college tour just for fun. You don't need to be there, besides skipping a day of high school, maybe. So people here on this campus continuously let people down, need a recalibration. The institution continuously has to respond to these types of things. So it's not like they're not happening. It's not like it's not prevalent in our society. Color blindness does not exist. We know the color that people are. And furthermore, color blindness and assimilation, we've moved past those as goals. We want to recognize people for the diversity that they bring and not to be like us, those people in dominant culture. So I feel like, I guess, issues of race come up frequently enough, and often enough as our country and our culture struggle with it enough that it's a worthy thing to at least touch base with, I guess, with my students. Any other questions, concerns, issues, or thoughts about this approach? Or really, I guess, anything from the class? I mean, here's the situation. If you're going into healthcare, you're going to be working with diverse people. Here's the situation. If you're going into rehab counseling, you're going to be working with diverse people. Here's the situation. If you walk outside your door, you're likely going to have to deal with diverse people in this world. So, you know, learning and understanding more about race and the dynamics of race and our place in it becomes very important to us in an ever increasingly diverse world. And again, I don't buy into the political correctness thing. I think that we are moving forward as a culture because we know what's right, we know what we've done wrong, and it's important that we correct that. And if you've given an unfair advantage to people to start decades and decades and decades and decades in, you know, start the race decades before other people, it's going to take time. But you know, even things like affirmative action, because they rub dominant culture so bad, are hardly implemented. It's a trigger word, but we hardly ever use it. I think 0.025 of all college applications are accepted or have to do with exclusively with race at all. That's 0.25%. So not enough to make a difference, even though we know there are some pretty big inequality pieces. All right, I'll drink this coffee for one more second and just make sure that there's no other questions. I want you to do well in the class. If you ever need to reach out, if you want to meet through Zoom. Yeah, and I hope that all of my students are not the students that are no longer going to be attending CU because of decisions made on alcohol and poor decisions made over the weekend. I saw that. I saw the response. And yeah, you know, I want my students to be masking up. I want my students to be staying safe. I want my students to be interacting with people at a high level of integrity around campus. So hopefully you are one of the people, or a whole class full of people, that are not going to be kicked out without the possibility of getting back in. Wow. Because that's a tough one. I don't know what I would fear more, talking to the school and having the school tell me I'm out, or telling my parents. Like, and I'm 47, but I'm trying to think back to that, and I'm like, ooh, boy, oh boy. We could talk about the privilege surrounding all of that instance too. But we'll save that for another chapter in another sociology class. Anyway, folks, be good people, do good things, mask up, stay safe, treat each other well. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Peace, everybody. Take care. Thank you.